This film, The Lighthouse, came from an idea that my brother had when I was 3 years into trying to get The Witch financed. My brother worked on it for a while, and I asked if I could take a crack at it. And immediately I put it to a period setting, and I read a lot of stories about lighthouses and lighthouse keepers, and I came across the story of Small's Lighthouse in Wales in the early 19th century, where there were two lighthouse keepers, both named Thomas, one older, one younger, and a storm comes to their lighthouse and they get stranded. But the idea of the two Thomases could be a cool two-hander about identity that could very quickly become strange. It was not a difficult film to cast. It's impossible to see it without Rob and Defoe. Willem and I had wanted to work together, and when The Lighthouse presented itself as something that could possibly get made, I sent Willem a Photoshop picture of him with the beard and a sou'wester hat, and he quickly came aboard.
When I read the script of The Lighthouse, it was pure pleasure. I liked the language, I liked the events. There were interesting things for the actors to do, and it was clearly going to be an adventure. And then when Robert Eggers told me how he was going to shoot it, that they were going to build a lighthouse on this bit of land in Nova Scotia and shoot out in the elements, it sounded great.
And Rob, I approached on another film, which he liked it, but he said that the role wasn't weird enough and he was only interested in doing weird things. And this was plenty weird, so he was happy to come on board.
At the time, I wanted to just do the most extreme, strange characters you could possibly find. And about maybe 3 months after I met him, Robert sent me an email saying, I think I've got something pretty strange, and sent it to me. And I was like, you are correct.
Thomas Wake, the grizzled old lighthouse keeper, is very much an archetype of the old salt. I think in anyone else's hands, it would be a laughable cartoon to have the pirate accent and the stump of the clay pipe. But Defoe is a master, and he commits completely, and he inhabits the character.
He's a guy that's been at sea for many years. He's very loyal to the whole mythology. He's a real believer that's all wrapped up in being a lighthouse keeper.
When I was doing research and trying to figure out how this character would talk, the most helpful author was a Maine-based author, Sarah Orne Jewett, who in the late 19th century was interviewing old sea captains, and they talked in this piratey dialect. So it is a real thing. Ephraim Winslow is an enigmatic character who both keeps to himself and makes a show of keeping to himself. You always care about the characters that Rob plays. So having Rob play Ephraim, we're immediately drawn into him, even if we sense that something is kind of off. And with it being just two characters, we have to love and care about both of these guys and not so much rooting for their objectives, because their specific objectives at times are deliberately unclear.
It sort of starts out incredibly serious and then it suddenly pivots, and I thought it was just hilarious and bizarre. And I loved what he does with his kind of regional colloquial dialects. I saw this one YouTube video of this little town in Maine where there were these accents which sort of sound like almost regional English accents, like West Country accents, but then mixed with really odd combination of dialects. And as soon as I heard that, I'm like, oh, that's absolutely fascinating. That kind of, there's a Maine accent which just sounds so bizarre.
Very often I have the atmosphere of the film in my head before I have the story. I knew that I wanted this movie to be black and white as soon as I figured that it was a two-hander in a lighthouse.
I think what's important for him and what he does and what's really exciting for me is that, he wants to transport people. This time it felt like it could be more photographic, just add that extra layer or two just photographically to take you there.
Black and white film stock has a look that you can't achieve any other way. And we wanted to have a look that was closer to orthochromatic film, because that early film stock shows the imperfections in your skin. And so Rob and Willem would look more weathered and we would see every pore. So Schneider made a custom cyan filter for us.
To evoke this time, one thing that would really help is this orthochromatic look, so the film would see blue and green and ultraviolet, and that's it. So the film is insensitive to red. Of course, red is a predominant color in skin tone. So your skin tones get really dark, and any fluctuation would be very pronounced, like blemishes, any little blood vessels, whatever, get really dark, because those would be more red, therefore darker. So, and blue eyes kind of can get eerie, like Willem's eyes, if you really look, are actually light and very pronounced against the pupil. So the thing about the filter is that it had like kind of a mirrored front, so it kind of shines stuff back, so you always had to look out for this kind of projected rectangle on the set.
Put your hand towards the lens.
When the film was just an idea, it was just atmosphere, it was going to be 133, which is an aspect ratio he loves.
Let's have you lean into shot and like realize that she's...
Sorry, hang on.
I was sort of aware of this movie tone aspect ratio, and I said, well, what would really do it is if it was 119. And then he was surprisingly into it, so it just kind of became that. I had to give him at least an HD video tab, so I have a modern camera.
Action!
Because aspect ratio, they had to mess around with the video tab for months, because it was made for HD. So how do you squeeze it? And that took a month to figure out.
Keep them steady, lad!
Because I wanted to take it a little further photographically, I went to Panavision and, they had some lenses out. They said, oh, here's some Baltars. These were much cooler, just holding them up, which was good news because we wanted to pass a lot of blue light. And they're made in the 30s. The most beautiful portrait lenses I've ever seen. They have a shimmer, the highlights glow, the windows kind of glow. Anytime you have some backlight, it just has a little smoothness to it. The shot of the eye and the peephole, just like the way his skin, the luminosity that, because we're going for a hard orthochromatic look with like lots of micro contrast, sharp grain, it would just balance that out, add another, layer.
It's a nautical movie. It has its own folklore. And my brother and I did a lot of research into Northeastern and Western European 19th century nautical folklore, but by sticking to the period details, we're locked down to like, this is what it was. So that makes a very clear bar for me and all of my collaborators to chase.
The creative process with Robert is pretty fantastic, and he, over the period of writing projects, puts together his own lookbooks, and so they come as a primer. Color is a huge part of costuming, and to try and think, if you're not using color to denote or to vary or to intensify scenes, then texture becomes very important. Contrast becomes very important. We are making everything that you see here, and they end up in the wardrobes of the characters. In this case, it's old and young. So we start from the skin out with period underwear. What we did in this instance was we replicated the equivalent of overlock stitching so that it would look authentic. Next we do shirts. This one was researched. This one is actually an example that I found on the internet, and we replicated it. This is another one. This is called a plastron shirt or a bib front shirt. Very interesting details as well. So it's a center front plus this piece, plus pockets. We made trousers. Even the suspenders we took apart and rebuilt so that they were specifically for this film. This is an example of a Guernsey sweater that was knit for the film. There's a lot of imagery in the script that has to do with sea. And in the stitching of this, there are different stitches. So there's waves, there's beach. And for Old, his was also hand knit. Old is the actual lighthouse keeper, so his uniform has the K's for keeper, and then it has the United States Lighthouse Establishment buttons, and they're all antique buttons. They were hard to find. The cap is modeled on the insignia of the period, and then we over-embroidered to make them different, because that's also what would have happened in the period. They would have had their uniforms made locally to specifications. These are our overalls that would have been present at the Lighthouse. And we did the stencil, and then we mounted it on the bib. And then we have a scene in the film where there's whitewash going on, and so they get stained. We keep them because they're referenced later. And then the oilskins, because it's set on the coast of Maine, we did a specific design that has this front flap. We did a short one for young, matching overalls and sou'wester. And these are actually made from two fabrics that are bonded together, Filson waxed, and then Filson waxed again, and then Filson waxed again. The fabrication part I love. It's always a challenge. And then I also really love the shooting part of the project, you know, to watch and to witness the characters come to life with the actors and wearing the clothing and making it their own is really thrilling.
Every building that you see in the film was made for the film. We built a 70-foot lighthouse tower and the keeper's cottage, and Craig Lathrop and his team did an incredible job. It was very difficult because the location, Cape Forshue, is this outcropping of volcanic rock, and there were 3 nor'easters that blew over Forshue while they were building this stuff.
We wanted this film to be in that shoulder. At the end of winter, early spring, everything was bleak. So what that meant for us is, of course, we were building everything in winter. We did quite a bit of research during pre-production. I relied quite heavily on instructions to a lightkeeper from 1881, the manuals that the lightkeepers used, sort of my Bible in terms of what lightkeepers did during their day, and how lighthouses work, and the Fresnel lenses, and the clockwork, and you know, all of that. I started off picking out the bits that I thought were going to be difficult to do. The Fresnel lens, I thought that would take extra time, which it did. And so I designed that. I was looking for one that we could rent, but we didn't find any. So that's where I started.
We have a Fresnel, you know, we visit a museum with a Fresnel lens. They put a 100-watt bulb in there. That's it. And because of the magnifying power of the lens, you see it out at sea, and that's all it needs. We never thought there would actually be a lens up on the location lens. I thought it would have to have a lighting effect. Craig sets expectations pretty high. He's like, well, it's so heavy, we'll never be able to get up there, you know. But then, of course, he does. And so we get the lens up there, and then I just put a 6K HMI in there.
With the Fresnel lens in the beacon and our powerful movie light, which was much brighter than the gas burner that would have been in there, I think that our lighthouse shone for 16 miles.
It's just like blinding, and we're across this bay from the town of Yarmouth, and you're just seeing this like kind of rectangular pattern, just like nailing these houses, just like right in their windows, and you're like, but it was still really cool.
We have a lot of sets that are sort of claustrophobic and specifically designed for that 1:19 aspect ratio. Most of the lighthouse works well for that frame and the breezeway and that claustrophobic house that they live in. There was one day when I got a call. We were building the scaffolding, which is the structure for the lighthouse, what holds it all up on the inside. And I got a call that they stopped working. The waves are crashing over the rocks, and all the spray is freezing to the scaffolding. So it was sheet ice. Well, okay, I guess you have to stop.
The interior of the tower and some of the other interiors were done on a stage. The diameter of the interior of the tower accurately was only 8 feet. So working in that incredibly small space, we need to be able to pull walls out to get our camera in there.
My most challenging day was really the most challenging week, and that was the week before camera. We started filming on day 1 out on Cape Forshue, which is where our exteriors were all located. And we had to have all of those sets ready on day 1. Part of the interior of the keeper's house we built twice so that we'd have some weather cover in case the weather wasn't what we wanted. We would have a place to go and continue filming. So that was a challenge because we had a very compressed time frame and I needed to have everything ready.
We shot in March and April. When I arrived, I remember right before we were going to shoot, we had a dinner or something to kind of celebrate the beginning of shooting. And on my way home from the dinner, to my little fishing cottage where I was staying, there was an incredible snowstorm. I almost didn't make it home. The weather was crazy because you're on a little spit of land in Nova Scotia, and sometimes the winds are so strong that literally it almost blows you off your feet.
There's a lot of weather that's just real. I mean, the most effective one was when they're waiting for the tender on that rock, you know, that kind of dusky scene, and they're just there, you know, and we were just shielding the camera so it didn't, you know, because you have this vertical film magazine that's just a sail, right? So we're trying to like stabilize the camera, but all that, you know, that was just what it was, you know. So what they're there like this, we were there like this, you know.
Many of the shots are in the script as is, but a lot of the stuff is in collaboration with my cinematographer, Jaron Blaschke. We collaborate very closely on the cinematic language.
Jaron, can you pan left a little?
And the clarity and the specificity would not be there without Jaron's input.
When we design a movie, you know, we kind of go off in our corners and shot list the movie and then come together, and sometimes it'll be a scene that I came up with visually or him.
You're shooting two different heights here?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. This
That's
is just
all.
the first part.
Perfect, I was just checking that.
This film was hard to photograph because of the black and white negative, and people aren't used to it. It requires a lot more light. There's scenes where there's one kerosene lamp on the table illuminating them, but that had like a light bulb in it that was blindingly bright so that we would get exposure.
This was not an uncommon amount of light on a film set until pretty recently. I mean, to shoot 80 ASA is, you know, they were doing that in the 80s, really. It's coming from a lantern that's right in front of your face. It's not like it's on a grid. Yeah, it's just 10 times more light than we're used to. As far as day and night, black and white, I found that like the day scenes would be brighter than I would normally go, you know, especially with ortho filter and, you know, making sure the skies are very bright. Because when you cut from night to day, you want that, you know, that impact.
Action! You're making eye marks in the logbook. Things gospel. I'll drop you down a few feet.
Where's my eyeline and stuff? Willem, where Willem would be.
Rob, no one works harder than Rob. He's insanely professional on set and is up for anything. He walked into the Atlantic Ocean in March like 25 times or something terrible like that.
Take a little bit, Rob. Say I am.
I am!
Take some more and say I am.
I am! I am!
He was always up for the challenge, and he's a very good physical performer and very smart. Obviously, he's made to do a lot of difficult physical tasks, but he's a big, strong guy, and sometimes those tasks actually would be quite easy for him to do. So he would, for example, like turn around a million times to make himself dizzy, and so that when I said action, it would be difficult for him to perform whatever task. I don't enjoy shooting with animals because they don't speak English very well, but animals are part of the world, and they're really important if you're trying to do mythological fairy tale type things. I had reservations about making the one-eyed gull such a large character in the film, even though I knew that I wanted Rob to kill a seabird and for that to be the catalyst for everything to go wrong. But my brother convinced me that conceiving the story with this gull would be the best. And when he wrote a sketch of a couple scenes, I realized, okay, this is pretty cool. But it was difficult to find trained herring gulls, and we had to actually go to England after the fact to film with trained seagulls.
Scene 94 part 2 or part whatever the fuck. Right. Snyder shot. That must be done also on a rock because we see their
Every film has its own challenges, its own process, its own identity. And this one, it's so grounded in Robert Eggers, really. I think it's interesting that it's very specific. It's something of a psychological thriller, I'd say. We had a quite brief rehearsal period, but it wasn't so much for the performing, it was really more to block out our movements.
All right, so that's a rehearsal.
Oh, we're going to do a rehearsal, but I want to watch.
Okay. Yeah.
Wyatt, rehearsing.
And get the geography of the scenes, because that was essential to realize where the camera would be.
Is that frame?
Frame.
Action.
Goddamn drunken, horse-shitting, short shit liar. A liar.
No.
Right.
Fast Dolly.
Okay.
Start reading, Rob.
Persistent slut lady. Attitude horse.
Rip. Okay, and that's it. Okay.
The visual language really led the way. And then once that visual language was established, that kind of was the discipline for us to make things happen in.
There are certain scenes I just could not wait to do. Approaching a script like this, you don't know how it's going to turn out. You don't know how each of these scenes will even work out. So it just felt like you're running up to a cliff and then just jumping off it.
I ain't finished yet.
Yeah, and Robert is kind of very particular in some ways, but then also really likes it when you're surprising him. But yeah, there's kind of weirdly a lot of freedom considering the script is very tight and kind of particular. I mean, it's like nothing's improvised or anything like that. It's all, every single little noise is in the script.
Even though we went further, I mean, it was good. The acting was nice. Let's try again.
You read this script, you get with Robert Eggers. He's giving you all these chances to do things that excite me, that are possibilities for a transformation, to have something happen to you, have an experience that you've never done before. It's deeply taking a walk in someone else's shoes, which is always, on some level, what performing is. So you don't feel a sacrifice. It's not easy. The conditions were terrible. I mean, real physical pain and challenge, but there was so much pleasure in what we were doing, it wasn't a problem.
Edgar Allan Poe's has an unfinished piece called The Lighthouse. And when I was in I think the third year of trying to get The Witch financed with no success, my younger brother, Max, mentioned that he was working on a ghost story in a lighthouse.
Max's plan, which he will later admit was rather overconfident, was that he was going to try and finish Edgar Allan Poe's famous unfinished short story, The Lighthouse. Eventually, of course, the script is nothing. There's Poe touches, but it's a very different story.
Poe's The Lighthouse is a scrap of a short story. At least that's what people think at the moment. It is barely a page long. It is a series of diary entries from a nobleman who was a new lighthouse keeper. And he just does 3 diary entries in this short story of arriving at the lighthouse and looking around, of being absolutely sure and saying it again and again to the extent that you wonder if it's absolutely true, that he doesn't mind being alone, that he really likes it, that isolation is exactly what he wants. But under all of this is the feeling that something is going to go terribly wrong, right from the first couple of lines.
His screenplay was a modern thing about a guy restoring a lighthouse with his dog, Neptune. But when he said a ghost story in a lighthouse, I pictured, a black and white, crusty, dusty, musty, rusty, and in a boxy aspect ratio. A couple months later, I checked in with my brother and I said, how's that script coming? And he said, it's not really working out. And I asked him if I could, steal the concept and do what I was thinking of. So I started researching and started writing a little bit. And at the time, I was so, just The Witch was not, no one wanted to make The Witch. And so I thought maybe 2 guys in a lighthouse would be cheaper and more achievable as my first feature. But then very quickly I realized there needed to be a storm if you're making a lighthouse movie. And so then it was no longer cheaper and more affordable, and I kind of put it away. But then after The Witch, I started working on some studio films that they were mine, I was writing them, but I didn't have the clout and the power to get them made the way I wanted to, and I could see that they might not work out. So I called my brother and said, why don't we write The Lighthouse together? I must admit I'm incredibly lucky that The Lighthouse got made. It's not a very conventional film, but I was just in a very lucky place in my career where I had been spending a couple years trying to make these larger studio movies, and and A24 and Regency, wanted me to be making something smaller. There were other people who wanted me to come back and make a small movie again. So when I had this script, people were interested. Maybe it's a crutch, and maybe it's something that I care too much about. But I really enjoy research. Like, it's truly fun. The Lighthouse was easier to research than any of the other films that I've made. There's just tons of books that are readily available about American lighthouses. Like, there's just a lot of fascination about them. And unlike 17th century English settlers in New England or Vikings, there's just so much. There's actual photographic evidence. And so I didn't have to turn to experts very often, because even just on Google Books, there's many from the 1870s, 1880s, 1910. There's lighthouse keepers' manuals that you can just read. So unless there was something that I needed help interpreting, it was all kind of there for myself and my brother to work with. And one of the first lighthouse stories that I read about was Small's Lighthouse in Wales, where two men named Thomas, one younger, one older, are stuck. They're marooned on this lighthouse. The older one dies of a heart attack, and the younger one goes insane. And that's not exactly this film, but it was. I sort of that inspired what this film became.
From the earliest drafts, the dialect is in place. Robert Eggers is convinced that the way people speak influences how they think and how they move, how they respond in any way. So you can't just write it in modern English and then try and translate it back. The character will shift accordingly. You have to write with the language that is correct for the time period. Robert Eggers is all about what is correct.
I usually research for about a month before I start doing any real writing. But during that research process, though, I'm taking a lot of notes, and occasionally, like an image, a moment, even the seeds of a scene, bits of dialogue kind of come through that, and I write it all down. And I usually begin with all of my notes in one confusing document that's only discernible to me. But as I continue to amplify my knowledge, then there becomes, things about story, documents about each character, documents about architecture or whatever, and different, note documents for different things. But I often do sometimes look back at that early mangled, messy thing, because sometimes there's some ideas that I had at the very beginning that I missed. And then of course there's folders of images, which begins just stuff to do with the lighthouse, but then gets separated into lighthouse towers and keepers' cottages and lighthouse tenders and mermaids and seagulls and whatever, and then from there, the best of those images then go into a lookbook, and a lookbook is kind of a mood board that is used to help get the film financed, because it shows kind of the look and feel of the film. And so when I have a script, I give that to the financiers or the studio or whoever as well, so that they can get a feel for what the film will be. But then it also becomes a really invaluable tool with my collaborators, with my production designer, set decorator, props master, costume designer, and with the Lighthouse and the Witch. Both of the films were so small and so contained that virtually every single prop I found a reference image for, personally, and put them in the lookbook.
I think he was very aware that a young filmmaker with one successful hit is not actually a great position to be in. It's an awkward position to be in. What you do next is going to haunt you, both emotionally and your career. You've got to get this bit right. And I think the slightly bloody-minded, but actually brilliant idea of, I'm going to take what appears to be a really uncommercial, absurd, tiny little prospect and make that my second film. It's actually a perfect career move on Robert Eggers' part, and it's not overtly horror.
There are some things about The Witch screenplay that have a kind of purity of thought that I probably won't ever be able to achieve again in my career. And it was like, how I've been thinking about films and storytelling and myself for my whole life up to that point. So there's a way in which there's a kind of purity there that, but I really don't enjoy watching The Witch at all, because it's not, I wasn't skilled enough to get what was in my head. I'm proud of many things about it, particularly the performances, but it didn't live up to, I couldn't get my imagination onto the screen. And The Lighthouse, I really was able to do that, more so than The Northman because of the scale. I don't want to watch any of my movies. I watch them a million times while I'm making them, but if I had to watch one, it would be The Lighthouse.
So with the finished script between the two Eggers brothers, it's down to casting. And of course, now that's also that the doors have opened. When The Witch came out, both Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson got in touch with Robert Eggers saying, loved the film, would love to work with you on something. In the case of Dafoe, Robert Eggers immediately thought, well, he'd be great as Wake, that'd be perfect, and talk to him about it.
And it was a major honor to work with Willem, who was maybe my biggest acting hero growing up. And Willem and I both come from theater. That's part of the reason why we get along very well. And also, I don't like to do a lot of table work, which is kind of discussing backstories and motivations and stuff. I like to just kind of start doing stuff. And Willem is also a fan of doing.
With Robert Pattinson, he'd been talking about another role entirely, a much more civilized role, 18th century gentleman of culture, which Robert Pattinson immediately said, I'd be playing myself. I'm not interested. I only want to do challenging roles at the moment. And so Eggers sent Pattinson the script and said, is this challenging enough for you? After Eggers had sent Pattinson the script, there was momentary silence. And then Robert Pattinson replied, he'd found a YouTube video with a young, presumably drunk, certainly a crazed young man that just kept screaming into his phone, I'm a demon, while talking to his friend. And Robert Pattinson just showed Robert Eggers this video and said, this is the film, right? And Eggers thought, yeah, okay, he understands the level of where we're pitching this. It comes to rehearsal for the film, and Robert Eggers immediately discovers quite a difference between his two actors.
If I'm directing theater, I'm expecting everyone to perform 110% during the rehearsals. But if I'm doing a film, I'm not expecting that. You just kind of give 50%, 70%, just indicate and save it for when the camera's rolling. But I do need to get a sense of pace. But Willem, coming from theater, was able to give 110% during the whole rehearsal period, which was crazy. And I think it frustrated Rob because Rob didn't like the idea of rehearsing, because Rob prefers to be totally spontaneous. Rob wants to surprise Willem, he wants to surprise me, he wants to surprise himself.
Whereas a lot of the time, film rehearsal is literally you stand there, you will then move over there. It's people shuffling around a space, learning the physical geography of this film. And you can tell that Robert Pattinson is immediately thrown by this. He does not enjoy rehearsal. He's very intimidated and admits as much frequently afterwards. He later said when Defoe and Pattinson interviewed each other, and he admitted that it was clear that Defoe understood the script better than he did at that point, and he found that quite intimidating, quite worrying. So he retreated quite distinctly inside himself, while Defoe is just getting bigger and bigger.
So the rehearsal process was interesting, but then, on set, it was Willem was kind of fine tuning my expectations, and Rob, on his first take was almost always his most truthful, and he would do whatever he had thought of, which was often like very different from what I imagined in my head. So then it would be many takes to then get him to what I imagined. But I would say more often than not, in the finished film, we use like the first or second take that's closer to how Rob saw the character than how I saw the character, which was a cool experience for me to learn that his instincts were better than mine.
It helps the film. He's quick to insist that he's not the sort of Stanley Kubrick style villain behind the lens that wants to make his cast deeply uncomfortable to get the greatest performances. But ultimately, this is a very confident old man that is very much in his comfort zone, with the young man entering into that world and finding himself a mermaid out of water.
Obviously, because it was expensive to build a lighthouse, we spent time scouting lighthouse stations, and anything that had the kind of look and feel and atmosphere that I liked was on an island and was completely inaccessible. So we shot on this peninsula of volcanic rock on the southern tip of Nova Scotia called Cape Forshue. And there was a lot of difficult things to pull off. It was difficult to actually build a lighthouse tower for real.
At first I wasn't looking at building one. I think we were looking at trying to find one. And we looked at least photographically, we looked at, I believe, every lighthouse that's in Canada and the US, and none of them really worked. They were either on a remote island, on an actual remote island that would have been way too difficult for us to shoot, or there were museums, and they were beautifully maintained but not appropriate for our story. So we came to the conclusion that we were going to have to build it. What was tough about that is it's a 70-foot tall structure with a small base, and the weather on Cape Forshue was terrible. So we placed it on top of some bedrock, and we were able to drill 4-foot holes and epoxy some anchors, some steel anchors into it to help hold it. Plus we filled it with cement blocks. And even with that, the engineer that I had said, in the unlikely event that there will be winds over 100 kilometers an hour, we had to have 4 safety cables onto it just to make sure that it wouldn't blow over.
And the environment is as harsh as just terrifyingly inhospitable as it looks on screen.
Very challenging, but that's what we wanted. We chose that place for the bad weather, and it certainly delivered.
The superstructure that was underneath the set was made out of scaffolding, tube and clamp scaffolding. We had a great company that was putting all that together, but there was one day I was in Halifax and I was working in the office, and I got a call that they had stopped work on Cape Forshue. We had very little time to build these sets. And I kind of freaked out. I was like, they can't stop. We don't have an extra day. They cannot stop for any reason. What's their excuse? Well, the excuse was that the winds were blowing and we were up on this very high piece of rock, but the sea spray was blowing up onto the structure. And seawater freezes at 20 degrees below zero. and it was hitting the scaffolding and had completely encased the scaffolding in ice because we were about 25 to 30 degrees below zero when they were working. So that was, thankfully the weather turned, and I think it was 2 days later we were able to get back to work. There was the foghorn signal house that we built. There was a boathouse with a ramp out into the water. Those are the main ones. We built all of those on location, including, as we said, the lighthouse, which we talked about. But then the lighthouse itself, we also built the stairwell inside a studio.
You really can't shoot in a real lighthouse tower and get anything that looks good.
The lantern house, which is on top of a lighthouse, that was also in the studio. And we built the interior of the keeper's house. A portion of it we built on location so that you could walk in and out of the house and have it be contiguous. But then we rebuilt the whole thing on stage. Not only did I build it crooked because I wanted it to be crooked, but I also needed to make it so that the house slanted so that we had a place for the water to gather, because there's a big scene where everything has been flooded and they wake up after the storm and there's water everywhere. So we had to build it sort of as a tank. So even where we had wild walls, that's where you are able to pull walls away so you could shoot through the set from different angles. Those wild walls had to be above sort of the tank, and how it came apart so that it could all hold water.
Everyone knows that the goal is accuracy. That's not achievable ever, even with the lighthouse where we have a lot of photographic evidence. There's no way that this can be like 100% historically accurate. But because everyone has this high bar and a shared goal, we all are easily tuned into each other. And I mean, it's gotten to the point where they know me so well now that they can say, like, that doesn't seem like Robert Eggers. Like, you don't want to do that.
When we were talking about doing the project, before it was greenlit, before we knew anything about it, I started working on trying to find a Fresnel lens. And I found one. It was in Australia. And the cost of shipping it and insuring it and using it for the show wasn't a possibility. So I knew I had to build one, and I've never built a giant Fresnel lens. So I designed it. I drew one up in Rhino 3D and did my best. And I found somebody who could build it. And then it was December, well before we still hadn't been greenlit, but we had a meeting with the producers in New York. And I flew down there and I brought my designs for the Fresnel lens. And like I said, we hadn't been greenlit, but I said, if we're going to shoot it, when we're going to shoot it, I need to start. I need to start building this because it's going to take a lot longer than we have scheduled for prep. I'm happy to say they didn't throw me out of the room and fire me on the spot, but they went for it and they started to build that. So that took the longest of everything we did.
When I was attempting to make my second short film, I was looking for a cinematographer, and I was looking at reels of up and coming cinematographers, and I saw something that looked a reel that was quite nice by someone called Yaron Blaschka, and I thought, all right, cool. Like maybe he's like a Central European or Eastern European interesting guy. And then it turned out he was Jaron Blaschke, and he was just a hipster like myself.
I got an email from a very young man named Robert Eggers. It was almost a formal email asking if I would shoot his short film he was doing called The Telltale Heart. I thought it was, I didn't know what to think because, it seemed like a kind of a student film and I was trying to get out of that a bit. But then I read it and there's no voiceover at all, which coming from a piece of literature was very impressive, and it was beautifully written. It was almost more of a short story than a screenplay. So I wanted to meet him.
As the relationship continues, Jaron has more and more of an authorial voice in the films that we make. We started out where initially I would make a shot list and he would make a shot list, and then we would kind of come together and like combine the two and distill the two. The Lighthouse was the first time that we were kind of coming up with things together.
The way I think of how to shoot a movie is advanced primarily through this making films with him, and so it's kind of it's hard to separate whose idea is what, really. When
my brother said Ghost Story in a Lighthouse, I assumed, I pictured a movie that was in 133, and then Jaron at some point over the years suggested, kind of as a joke, 1:19:1, which is an early sound film aspect ratio.
Which is a ratio that lived briefly as film transitioned from silent to sound.
I've done a lot of still photography, so I'm used to in medium format, which is something like that, 1.3, 1.4. I've done a lot of Hasselblad, photography, which is square, so it's not really that difficult for me to sort of see things in a square. I find it easier actually, so it doesn't really. It was just an opportunity to make something in within a frame that just is more natural to us. And
I said, actually, that's cool. Why not? Let's go for it. And the reason why it's a great aspect ratio for the movie is that it says old, but also it's perfect for the claustrophobic interiors, and it's also good for shooting vertical objects like, say, a lighthouse tower, and it's great for close-ups. Right before we left to go to Nova Scotia, I thought maybe this is like not such a good idea, so I watched a whole bunch of movies in 1:19:1 to kind of be sure that we could do it. And it's kind of interesting because Fritz Lang a lot of times has like bits of stairwell, or he finds kind of objects to go up on the bottom of the top of frame sometimes to create the illusion of a slightly wider frame. I think, like basically if you wanted to shoot a film with sound in this period, this was the aspect ratio that you were stuck with. But then when I saw Pabst's Kameradschaft, which takes place in a mine, and so that has these cramped interiors of the mine, and it has the tall smokestacks, and for that film, it really was kind of the perfect aspect ratio. And I it feels like this film and Kameradschaft are the two films that enjoyed having this aspect ratio, whereas some of the I'm sure Fritz Lang sometimes wished he had a little more elbow room in the movies that he was shooting in this aspect ratio.
He shot on Kodak, Eastman XX film, used on a number of very famous, beautifully textured black and white films, such as Schindler's List, for example. He experimented with digital and tried to see if it could work, but it just didn't have that tone they wanted, that real negative, that beautiful grainy, the quality of tinted film.
Chris Columbus, who's an executive producer on the film, I showed him a restored Blu-ray of a Jean Epstein film and I said, that's the kind of look we're going for. And he said, well, yeah, I can see how you need to shoot on film to get that kind of look. And if it's going to look like that or something in the ballpark, people haven't seen that, since the silent era.
Yeah, I mean, the cameras were modern. The camera support was modern. We're on a Technocrane. We had no one makes film cameras anymore, but we had their latest version. It was a, Panaflex XL2. Digital cameras, they have all this detail in the shadows, and their highlights, just fall apart. And then in film, it's better overall, but the shadows do fall off faster, and the highlights go on forever. So it's just a different look. And digitally, your shadows are noisier than your highlights. In film, your highlights are noisier than your shadows. Digital just kind of looks everything smoother and a little bit flatter, So maybe it's a subtle difference to some, but I think especially in black and white, when you're dealing with a film that, they stopped improving in 1959, compared to whatever, an Alexa or something, it's quite different.
But he used genuinely vintage lenses. He hunted and sourced 1930s film lenses to keep experimenting with the look of the film to get the imagery he wanted.
It's a characteristic look, just from 30s and 40s, and it just had just enough kind of swirl and highlight shimmer that just evoked not the period of the film really, but just kind of earlier filmmaking, and it complemented the orthochromatic filter, which tends to make things very textured. So it kind of it was like kind of if you could give a little glow on top of something that's a little harsh in texture. I just like the way that combination went together. Little tiny lenses, the lens is this big, the glass inside's like that, So just also when I tested them, those most beautiful portrait lenses I'd ever seen. I found something just now that I like even better, but at the time I'd never seen anything like it.
When it came to filters, that was slightly more difficult. He had to have several custom-built filters to again allow enough light to be practical, but to give this quality that is the third main actor in the film, I think.
Jaron showed me that he wanted to use a filter, this blue filter that I had never seen before, that would help shift all the reds towards black, which is sort of the opposite of what most people do with black and white photography. Usually they put a filter that shifts the reds lighter so that your skin looks beautiful.
When you don't see red, it looks a lot different than when you do in black and white, because skin tone is mostly red tones. So imagine, if you have a red rose, it can't see it, so it would be black, and so anything that the redder something is, the darker it is. So lips go dark, like the bags of my eyes would be even darker, blemishes, et cetera, et cetera. So, and if you look at a lot of documentaries from the 20s, they all have this characteristic look. I wanted that look. It just was very transportive to be able to shoot it that way. So orthochromatic films don't exist. You can buy them as still photography as sheet film, but as far as movies are concerned, you can't, there's no longer orthochromatic film. So I had to have a custom filter made that's just blocks off all the red light. So
what that meant for me was anything that was warm would shift towards black. Even oak, even wood that was made out of oak would shift towards almost charcoal. And so I had to sort of figure out not just what colors would turn like in black and white, but how they would change with this filter. So I made a custom filter for Lightroom, and at first was just taking pictures of everything, so I could see what that shift would do. But it didn't take very long till it became second nature, and you sort of understood what was going to happen.
Before the Lighthouse, I had really only done one short film that was shot in black and white, and it was fascinating. But the question of are there particular, should it be a naturalistic palette for the costumes, or should I explore perhaps using different colors of fabrics that might look better in black and white than they would if we were shooting it in color. I was always very conscious of switching my settings on my phone back and forth between color and black and white if I was taking photographs of things, so that I could see what was the contrast like. Did a particular fabric in a particular color, was the texture heightened if it was in a different color? When one looks at stills from production, you can see the costumes in there, the color that they actually were made in, as opposed to what we filmed, and it is all a part. It's all a part of the same world. It was really quite magical. The textures, the shades, they all seem to work. I think that they fade to black when they need to, and they pop when they need to. So, in the end, I was really happy with it.
I got a reputation for natural light, but that did not carry through on the Lighthouse because the black and white film the way I was filtering it, and I was also pulling a little bit in the processing just to get a little more latitude out of it. So we're talking about 10 to 12 times more light than like a digital camera. So that's on a modern set, that feels like a lot of light.
So during the shooting outside the lighthouse, it was all of the windows were covered in a muslin, and the light shining through them was unbelievable. It was very hard on the crew to actually be in the environment because it was so bright.
A lot of people would go around with sunglasses on the crew, especially in a small space, and you have a I don't remember if it was a 650 or 800 watt lamp, bulb in a lamp, like on a table, an arm's length away, So if you look closely, Willem Dafoe's pupils are quite small, because he's just right next to that 800 watt bulb. It was hard to tell if anything looked good at all because everything just looks so bright. So you have to look in the viewfinder and like stop it down to see the lighting ratio. So it was a big learning curve for me.
Earlier in my career, I was really kind of anti-storyboards. And that's I sort of thought that storyboards would kind of kill spontaneity or creativity somehow.
Now we storyboard a lot, kind of everything. I think our ambitions, we go up with each film. The Lighthouse, we had, it was our first time of having some fancy shots, first time on a techno crane, et cetera. We weren't storyboarding a lot. I think it was just sort of the end of the movie, the beginning of the movie, and a couple things in the middle.
So Willem Dafoe said something interesting, which is that people kind of think if there's no improvisation and there's no spontaneity, then there's no magic. But, I can rehearse and plan for one thing. And if I actually deliver that one thing with utter authenticity, it should be just as real as something that's improvised, And I think he's right. One of the things that this film did is that it finally gave me some confidence with VFX. Like again, compared to a lot of movies, there's not that many, there's not that much CG. It's mostly comp work. But there's far more than The Witch, and so I kind of started to understand like the workflow and the work that that the animators and the compositors are doing. And so, developed just, more confidence there. It was also my first time working with, big movie stars who are not going to audition, and you just have to trust that it's going to work. I mean, obviously, it's not so much to trust those actors. They're so great, but it is a different thing. Just kind of saying we're going to do this together. The end, let's jump in.
You learn that you just move forward and work hard and you'll figure it out. You trust that you can figure it out. There's a lot of very specific things that I learned about lighthouses and lighthouse keepers and all of those things. Every show you do, you sort of, it's like a history lesson, and you get to discover all of that, which is extremely fun. But on this particular one, we had a very little time. And when I first read the script, I had not a clue how we were going to do it.
I have only fabulous memories of working with Robert on each film, and I think at the end of each film, I think, wow, and I say to my family and friends, wow, that was the best experience of my working life.
On a technical level, that was a big thing for me. I'm grateful I didn't, pardon my language, fuck it up, because it's just a lot of frontiers for me. And so looking at it now, because I regraded it for HDR and about last year, it looks pretty simple as far as the coverage, and that's great. That's perfect for the movie. But I feel like we've off of that grown a lot. I know I've grown a lot as far as how to block a scene and shoot a scene. So it feels kind of quaint rewatching it, to be honest, but still perfect for the movie.
It is the film that I am the most proud of, just because it came out much closer to how I imagined it than The Witch or The Northman. Because again, The Witch was a huge step coming from short films, and The Northman was a massive step coming from The Witch and the Lighthouse.